Hello. So today I am back with another video, and today I'm going to be discussing Xi Jinping and China. So full disclosure, this is not going to be one of those anti-China videos or really pro-China videos even. So although I'm not the biggest fan of Xi Jinping's policies personally, I really wanted to kind of get past all of that and offer, I think, mostly an academic, but also just kind of for fun analysis of his policies, the context in which they're happening, and offer kind of an uncommon comparison, right? So as you can see here, my personal thesis is that I think Xi Jinping is most similar to the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany in the 1870s, which is a very uncommon comparison. I don't think it's kind of really been thrown around. I haven't seen it anywhere so far. I might be wrong, but I'll kind of go over this brief little website that I've made to kind of explain my thoughts. So number one, just to get the elephants in the room out of the way. So I think a lot of kind of comparisons that she is kind of put up against range from Mao obviously to Deng Xiaoping, to even like old Chinese emperors, right? So they're all these kinds of like time covers, Time as in the magazine covers of like she as the emperor, she as Mao, all these kinds of very antiquated comparisons, I think, just because since she is such a powerful and kind of dominating figure in Chinese politics, I think the natural instinct is to compare him to previous Chinese leaders, which I think, makes sense to some extent, but I think China's really never been in the state that is right now. So for example, if you were to compare him to Mao's China was such a poor and impoverished country that I don't think he's really comparable to Xi in any way, because they're just leading such fundamentally different countries, right? Even the old emperors, right? On the other side of the spectrum, when the old emperors were kind of reigning, China was so powerful and so obviously the superpower of the world that they weren't really on the ascendant, right? But Xi is unique in that he is leading a China that was poor and is becoming rich again, right? He's leading a China on the ascendant, and that's really never happened to this degree in Chinese history, and there's never been quite a rival like the U.S. in China's history either, right? Because for most of China's history, it was indisputably like the number one power in its region, and so it was never really subject to any kind of real rivalry. So I put together a brief timeline. Please don't critique the events too much because they're kind of loose, but we'll come back to this timeline. But I think basically that we are around this point, right? So I'll kind of go over the general events that are covered in this chart. So Xi Jinping, Otto von Bismarck. Okay, so let's start with the actual people. So Xi is a very strong leader, which kind of should be obvious, but if you don't know, Xi had a very rough childhood. His father was a very high-ranking party official, but he was purged. He was purged by Mao during the Cultural Revolution, and so Xi was sent down to work as a worker peasant student in the kind of the rural fields of China. And so he had a very kind of rough childhood that way, and he basically fought his way up slowly through the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party over the course of decades. And Bismarck is kind of similar. So Bismarck, again, his father was also a kind of, I believe they're called Junkers, or kind of a very wealthy nobleman in Prussia, but he wasn't he wasn't in the kind of the core circles of what were the Prussian nobility at the time, right? So he also had to kind of fight his way into the system while also kind of being born of the system. And these are just a few quotes by other people of the era. And so the word that kind of keeps coming up in both Xi and Bismarck's kind of stories is iron, right? So like people keep saying that they both have iron in their souls or iron in their wills, stuff like that. Cool. Okay. And then they also have very famous speeches, and so Chancellor Bismarck has this very famous speech called the Iron and Blood speech, where Iron and Blood, yes, I call it a Blood and Iron, but it's actually Iron and Blood, where he basically says that the the great moral questions and the great kind of conflicts of Europe of the day won't be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. So basically, he's espousing a doctrine of just sheer force rather than kind of diplomacy and compromise, right? So, which very much characterizes the overall mood of the late 19th century in Europe. And I think I chose a Belt and Road speech, but I'm sure there are other speeches that are a bit more similar. But basically, in this speech, Xi kind of outlines his vision for the future of Asia in general. And so this is not this speech is not as belligerent as the Iron and Blood speech, but it still kind of outlines his vision that he wants China to be the center of a new world order, right? So the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road speech, basically set up a worldwide infrastructure project where China would basically fund all of these ports and bridges and all these kind of big projects all around, essentially the entire world. And I think this kind of goes to show like the extent of his ambition and the extent to which she really wants China to be at the center of this new kind of world order. Cool. Okay. So now, just a few more points here. So, the overall context of kind of the nations they're leading at the time. So, I think you'd have to be living under a rock not to notice that China has just been going through this massive era of growth and reform recently. And so for the past 40, 50 years, right, since the 70s and 80s, China's GDP has gone from almost near third world country levels to being the second largest in the world, rivaling the U.S., right? And so they basically went from a nation of poor farmers to a technological superpower in the matter of one generation, essentially, which is really, really impressive. And on the other side is German industrialization. So this is around the era where the Industrial Revolution was happening more generally, but I think German industrialization is very unique, just due to the speed and the kind of the intensity to which it happened, right? So this is around the time where, for example, the automobile was invented in Germany. This was around the time where like all sorts of famous chemists and physicists were kind of active in Germany. And so this is really the era of kind of German will to power, and a lot of massive growth on both the part of the nation as a whole and just like their technological capacity. And okay, so with this context of a very, very strong leader and this massive technological change, obviously leads to increased pride, right? So I think, okay, this is a bit of a more controversial section just because obviously everybody should kind of be proud of the country, but this is also around the era where kind of extreme ultranationalism arises, both in China and in Germany, right? So, if you look anywhere on the internet these days, you'll notice a lot of very fervent nationalism on the side of kind of Chinese internet users. And hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying this, but I think it's very clear that there are a lot of people in China, both in China and in the diaspora, that very much think that this is kind of China's moment in the sun, and that this is basically the key moment that'll allow them to overtake the U.S. and regain their status as the number one power in the world. And by the way, around this time, right, so around the Bismarck era, is also when Germany was going through a similar period of extreme nationalism, which is now referred to as the Völkisch movement. Völkisch. So Völkisch means people or folk. And this eventually does lead into the Nazi era, but not quite yet. So the Völkisch movement is basically a proto-Nazi kind of movement that basically reasserts the fact that the German people are in fact one people and that they have like very unique kind of destiny in the world, right? And so this idea of like the folk and like blood and soul and all that all kind of arise from this era. Cool. Okay. Just a few more. But okay. So now that you have a very strong country with a very kind of strong sense of national pride, the number one thing you need to do is to suppress any local movements to gain independence and to kind of consolidate power within your own borders, right? And so I think in the case of China, I think most people know the major stories. So for example, Xinjiang, what's going on with the Uyghurs. I added Inner Mongolia and Hong Kong, but basically there have been all sorts of much more explicit movements to suppress the local minorities and kind of their sense of identity, I guess, in favor of a unified Chinese identity. And so that's all I'll say for that for now. Whereas on this side, German unification. So German unification. So for context, so before this, Germany was not a country. Germany was a kind of a vague idea, but it was a kind of a shared identity between a bunch of different countries. Most notably, Prussia and Austria were the two biggest ones, and there were a bunch of smaller states in between. But Prussia, which is the nation that Chancellor Bismarck led, kind of led the wars of unification, and so they conquered Austria, and then they conquered like a lot of the neighboring countries to kind of prevent them from stop them from preventing German unification. And so there are all these wars that most people have never heard of, but basically the end effect was that you have a unified China on the one side and you have a unified Germany on the other side. Cool. Okay. And then the crisis. So all major kind of power grabs, I guess, need to have a crisis. And so the crisis here, number one on the left side, is the Chinese economic crisis that's kind of going on right now, right? So if you don't know, there's a giant real estate bubble that's recently popped in China. And so there's just a lot of kind of chaos around what exactly the government is going to do about it. But I think it's pretty clear that China is kind of going through a prolonged period of probably lower than expected growth, and there's going to be a lot of attempts to hide it, to minimize it, and things like that. And in Germany around this time too, there was the Panic of 1873. So this is kind of not as well remembered today, but the Panic of 1873 was essentially an economic recession / depression in most of Europe, but most notably in Germany, right? Because again, Germany was on this meteoric rise economically, but then the Panic of 1873 kind of put that to its brakes, and there was just a lot of chaos and a lot of kind of political turmoil. And I also pointed out, very interestingly, that they both occurred 11 years into the leader's rules, right? So the Chinese economic crisis, 2024, it's exactly 11 years into the rule of Xi, and Bismarck, 1873, also exactly 11 years. Cool. Okay. I'm gonna skip this for now, just because I don't think it's as relevant. Okay. So the final kind of prediction is that a little bit after all this happened in Germany, at least back then, what ended up happening was that now that Germany was consolidated internally, they started to expand externally. And so they both picked fights with a lot of kind of different European countries, and they also started to form a lot of colonies overseas. And so the German colonial empire is not as remembered today because it wasn't as large as the British or French empires, but it was still very much a thing. And I think this happens a lot in kind of world history, where a nation or kind of polity will be unified, and then they go out on this attack spree, essentially, on other nations. Cool. Okay. And so my slightly controversial take, maybe not, is that I think China is also bound for some kind of expansionist streak. So maybe not through like overt military expansion, but maybe through like more diplomatic means, but I think it's very much clear that she does have somewhat expansionist aims. So that's what that is. Cool. Okay, so this was okay. So back to the timeline. So this was what this timeline was, right? So I attempted again to somewhat align the reigns of Xi and Bismarck and kind of the major events of their reigns. But again, please take this with a giant grain of salt. Okay, cool. I'm not gonna go over all this because it's mostly a repeat of what went earlier. Cool. All right. Well, so that was my kind of very brief and very weird thesis, but let me know what you guys think. Again, it's a very controversial topic, but I think it's very important to talk about because I think the current chains of thought around where China is going is very clouded by a lot of modern biases, right? So people compare it to the Cold War or to Mao or to Deng or to all these other figures. But I think it's very important to kind of take a look at the larger context, right? So not just like Xi the man himself, but also like where China is and the larger context that in which the modern China is operating today. And when all that is taken into account, I think that no real modern comparison can be made, and that really, whether it's Bismarck or another figure, we should look larger rather than kind of try to insert our own kind of like modern biases. Cool. All right. Well, so let me know what you think, and thank you for watching this video.